Hello and welcome to Thinking Out Loud. I'm your co-host, Cameron McAllister.
And I'm your co-host, Nathan Rittenhouse.
All right, it's June, which means it is Pride Month. And so
Every year.
Every year. So we wanted to talk a little bit about that. And I think one way to begin, Nathan, would be we've made occasional reference to Aaron Renn's article for First Things, Three Worlds of Evangelicalism. I keep consistently mistitling it. I keep calling it Three Phases of Evangelicalism. It's actually Three Worlds of Evangelicalism. So apologies to Aaron Renn for that. But yeah, the positive, the neutral, and the negative. And he argues that we entered into the negative world in earnest in 2015 with the momentous Obergefell versus Hodges Supreme Court decision on gay marriage. That's the point, says Aaron Renn, and I think convincingly, that Christianity is largely starting to be viewed by our cultural elites as something that's bad, dangerous, bad for in the individual and bad for society. And I think you feel that. I think Christians feel that, especially this month with its heavy emphasis on the LGBTQIA plus community. I think the word community is straining credibility more and more. And
well, you
I
have more people who are
about that, but
yeah. So you know, on a lot of the conversations we've had, Cameron, where I have argued that you have to have geography to have true community. You can't point to this community and say this is where all these people are, in the same way that you can point and be like, this is where the Taiwanese are. So it's inconsistent with the way that I use community, but that is broadly the term that's being attached to it. I think it's a bit of a stretch, and other people are recognizing that now too, just because of its lack of geography, and it's not homogenous internally. And I think that's perhaps where you're going with this, is to say it isn't really, you're looping a lot of different ideas together under one umbrella, but they don't all cohabitate under that umbrella nicely, perhaps.
Yeah, and I think this is being talked about more, but I'd like to just explore it for a second, because some of our listeners may not have considered the internal conflicts. And I think, again, the source here is Carl Trueman's The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self. He has a whole section where he talks about the internal tensions with the LGBTQIA plus community. Gosh, it's a mouthful. You have to say that every time. But for instance, the easiest example to point to are people who would identify as homosexual. By and large, most people who would say that they're homosexual are committed to a traditional understanding or biological understanding of, it's weird to use the word traditional here, isn't it? They're committed to a biological understanding, at least, of gender. They believe in that biological distinction. People who self-identify as trans do not. They would say that gender is nothing more than a social construction. And so there's very real tension there between these two groups. And so Truman points out that what appears to some people on the outside to be this unified community is in fact little more than a political alliance, and that it's a pretty fragile one at that. So I think it's worth pointing that out, because there are a lot of contradictions that people in these kind of progressive leaning circles are beginning to feel firsthand, and they're beginning to see it in their own communities, because there can be this impression, at least, that you got this world unified outside the church against the church. But it's not really a very rich unity. It's more along the lines of the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of deal. Mm-hmm. So I think that's one thing to bring up. Also, because practically in our conversations, as we're thinking about this with regard to people we love, friends, family members, kids, we can begin to understand some of the tensions that people are living in. And that can undergird some of our conversations. But I think there's that sense where we need to understand that those tensions as they exist, but also we're increasingly coming to a place now where we are having to make our peace with being cultural outsiders in some sense, and we need to be comfortable with that. Not saying
So
we play up our antagonistic side, but
let
yes.
me ask about that though, because that does seem to be the unifying feature of the LGBTQIA plus group is to say
Mhm.
we are the outsiders. And so it's
For sure.
what I find to be interesting as I kind of sit here on and look both ways is that both groups feel like they're the minority. And that's fascinating to me because that can't it's not mathematically true. Well, so here's where it's weird is that okay, if you want Christians who have a biblical convictional understanding of marriage, they do outnumber largely the LGBTQIA plus community numerically. However, if you're looking at cultural influence, it's flipped around the other direction. And so
Mhm.
there's a sense in which both people, depending on which element of this you're looking at, feel like the minority, and then both thrive on using minority and outsider language in order to unify their groups against their perceived cultural other and oppressor. So that's I think that's a challenge for the church there is to not adopt a woe is us, everybody's against us. That can be true, but it cannot be the foundation of your identity. It's like you kind of have what's a good analogy? So you ever see like two people pass each other on a motorcycle and they wave like all
Mhm.
motorcycle riders wave at other motorcycle riders like it's like a little inside like they don't have the same kind of motorcycle, they're not wearing the same jacket or the same helmet or even going in the same direction, but it's like hey, there's somebody on a motorcycle like they do the
Mhm.
little low hand thing.
Solidarity, man.
Solidarity
Yes.
thing, yeah. Or maybe you pull up beside somebody in traffic who's driving the exact same car as you. Or what? I mean, they're all these little sub cliques and cultures of feeling like we're other than, and that binds us together. Um, just let's just keep in mind that that is part of the
Yeah.
dynamic that's at play here. On and for many people, you say, well, it's a false, false dilemma to mark this down into two sides. There's a lot of flexibility and fluidity, even among a lot of churches, about how lines and boundaries and distinctions are drawn or not drawn. But anyway, just keep in the back of your mind that interesting idea that everybody sees themselves as the minority and as the victim in this entire conversation, which probably can't be true.
Well, one thing to note here. So we're in a politically polarized moment. This happens from time to time. And the temptation then to, strongly, to become part of a group and to unite around a common enemy, it's much more pronounced in times like this. Sociologists have done a lot of work on this recently. The irony of that, though, is that if Christians go that route, that's basically mirroring some of the cultural strategies of a lot of these groups where they will unite around particular grievances. Now, I know that's controversial language that I'm using, but the word grievance actually plays a pretty big part in even the academic fields of critical theory in particular. And a lot of people will unite around a sense of shared victimhood, and then the dynamic that usually informs those groups has a lot to do with the enemy of my enemy is my friends. So here's how you see it in Christian community. Often you'll see Christians for so I will name names here just because I think we need some clarity. But somebody like Milo Yiannopoulos, yeah, for a while was very popular among certain kind of more aggressive culture warring conservative Christians because he was
Mhm.
a man who self-identifies as gay but was very politically conservative. And let's face it, he just was he a lot of people saw him as a great person to go own the libs. So that's an example of the kind of
Dave
Dave
Rubin
Rubin.
now is
Yep.
the phase
Dave
two of
Rubin,
that, I
and
think.
then somebody, even Douglas Murray, is often, I think, viewed in terms not dissimilar to this. I like
Oh, right.
Douglas
Yep.
Murray, by the
Mhm.
way, as a thinker. I think I've appreciated a lot of what he has to say. But at the same time, I don't want to succumb to the to use him as some sort of cultural weapon. And have a clip or a soundbite from him ready, to fire at somebody and say, "Hey, and by the way, he's gay, so you can't, he's got that kind of he's bulletproof there." That's a tactic that's and a strategy that Christians have no business indulging in that. It's a strong temptation, but also, see, we've got a
Mhm.
big challenge ahead of us in a number of different ways. Well, the first is to be very clear. So, we as Christians need to be upfront and clear that Christianity itself condemns these the LGBTQIA plus condemns these practices and these modes of sexual expression. It does very clearly, and
Yeah,
we
but
need
only
to
for like
be, but we
2,000
need to be
years.
upfront about that.
So there's some ambiguity there.
We both know many stories, Nathan, of sadly of church leaders who choose for various reasons, sometimes with the best of intentions, to try to soft pedal these issues and to even in some cases quietly in their own congregations undermine traditional Christian sexual ethics in an effort.
Well, or I mean, I've got multiple books on my shelf here
Or
of
people, yeah, just explicitly,
justifications for all sorts of
right.
biblical interpretive frameworks for looking at. Yeah,
So there's
yeah. So
huge, well,
it's not that I haven't
there's
read them.
huge pressure.
It's just I want to
Right.
hear
So
what
there's huge pressure on
other people
Christians to
think. But
capitulate here because you it is more than one thing can be true at the same time simultaneously. So on the one hand, have people who are, let's just sexually marginalized or sexual minorities, have they experienced a lot of grief and pain and suffering unnecessarily? So yes, I think they have. Yes, we can definitively say that there are some real shortcomings on the part of the church, because the church is made up of human beings, and human beings make terrible mistakes. That's not to explain it away. That's not to justify it. But that is also, you need to operate with the proper anthropology. So it's not as though the church has had some unprecedented failure here that disqualifies it from any kind of moral voice here. No, it's that the church is made up of people who have made, and some of them have made serious mistakes here. That's true. It's also true to say, though, that the cultural zeitgeist is completely in the direction of sexual liberation these days, more so than ever. Now, that doesn't mean that people who self-identify in some of these categories aren't experiencing real fear or pain in some of their communities. But by and large, the zeitgeist, the sense of the cultural winds are in their favor. Clearly, the people who are sort of the minority position would be a traditional
Mhm.
Christian sexual ethic these days.
Oh, I can prove this to you.
Oh
Remember, we did
yes.
the podcast on Harrison
Hmm.
Butker's line about Pride Month, and not having pride in like the seven deadly sin sense. Yeah. So, I mean, if you want to think, is there a cultural backlash against what was traditionally thought of as the biblical
Yes.
thoughts on
There you go.
marriage?
Exhibit A. Just look at the way
I'll
that's
give
been
you
received.
example A
So
recently.
I think, but we need a commitment to clarity, but we also need a commitment to taking up our cross in the midst of this, which doesn't mean that we're rolling over and playing dead. It doesn't mean that we're pushovers. It doesn't certainly doesn't mean we have no backbone. But again, the temptation among many who are experiencing some serious repercussions of this, of some of the push from the LGBTQIA plus group, has gotten increasingly aggressive and invasive in work environments. I mean, we know people, we've talked to people who are experiencing, there are policies, corporate policies are being rewritten around this, and people's livelihoods have been threatened. So we need to be, yeah.
I mean, so you can think of this like let me throw in a little conversation I had here. Um, so you're thinking, I think, like corporate policy, like law firms in DC or Wall Street corporations. I was having a conversation with somebody who was on the Pennsylvania Dairy Princess board. So like Pennsylvania nominates a dairy princess who becomes a representative of the dairy farmers and travels around to high schools. And so they're in the middle of this entire thing of like trying to rewrite how do they say
Oh
that they
my
would like
goodness.
a
Yeah.
biological
Yep.
female to be the
Yep.
dairy princess because that's the way like and
Hmm.
so it's down to that level of this is like local like 4-H plus kind of category of saying how do we're running out of language to say what we want to have said when it comes to, and so it just breeds confusion everywhere. Um, so yeah, so I mean, the practical outworking of the difficulty of, or the lack of clarity around this is phenomenal. Um, and maybe it's not just organizations; it's down to, individual families and even what's going on in your own mind. But
Right. And so
the cat's
we
kind of
bring
out of
this
the
up
bag on
also
clarity.
just to point out that there are many people who understandably, so let's say there are many theologically conservative traditional Christians who are asking very practically, okay, what do we actually do? How do we respond to this? Some of us are in danger of losing our livelihoods. Our religious liberty as is at stake. And so there are important struggles ahead of us. And I think what we want, and neither Nathan nor I, our specialty is not law. We're not we're not lawyers, and we're very grateful for Christians who are faithful presences within that world and who are standing up and working on, who are committed to religious liberty and working on behalf of people who have been targeted in some cases. But what we can talk about is a basic principle of the Christian faith that's more debated these days. So there was an article recently that came out, Nathan, and I'm bringing this up for the first time here. I don't know if it crossed your radar, but basically, you know how a lot of this takes place, a lot of these battles on niceness and winsomeness take place in the pages of First Things Journal. For whatever reason, that's the
Mhm.
that's ground zero for discussions on strategies of niceness or increasing antagonism. In this case, it wasn't against David French. You remember the whole Frenchism thing from Sohrab Ahmari? He kind of that became a thing and it
Oh
hasn't
yeah,
gone
yeah.
away. This one actually was not against David French. It was against Carl Truman of all people. So when you're getting to a place where Christians are saying, yeah, Carl Truman is not clear enough. He's not fierce enough. We need something more. I mean, and we both I think appreciate Carl Truman a lot. But basically, this article was saying there are times where we need to do more than we can't really just love our enemies. We're going to have to actually do something. We really have to fight back. There are times where we set some of that aside because the civilizational threats are so strong. You know the language by this point, Nathan. I wrote an article recently for Christ and Pop Culture against this mindset. One way I heard it articulated was that this is the tragic view of history, where basically sometimes, desperate times call
Mhm.
for desperate measures, i.e., in this case, the article was arguing for a Donald Trump being a desperate measure and arguing that he was a figure like one of the great and ruthless military generals like a Sherman. So, and I argued, I don't think Christians have a tragic view of history. I think we believe that life is a comedy because we know it will end well.
So okay, hang on. So this is an interesting point for me to jump in here and ask some questions, because let me back up just so I don't lose you. You
Hmm.
called for, as a first principle, clarity here. I think one of the things that's been helpful for me to clarify where I'm at on this
Mm.
is to stop using the word traditional. Now, I know this might sound like a shocker, but like, because traditional marriage gets thrown around a lot, in these conversations. And when you say traditional marriage, okay, like in your little Christian bubble, that makes sense. But anybody who hears the word traditional outside the context of the church thinks a tradition is something that you just do because you
Mm.
like it, and that's the way that it's always been done. That's usually the reason for a tradition. So if you substitute the word conviction instead of tradition, it makes way more sense. So if you say, I believe in a convictional model of marriage based off of what Christ taught, that's different than saying I have a traditional view of marriage. One of those seems malleable, one of them doesn't, primarily because Jesus makes his statements based off of creation. Um, so in that is, I think there's a little bit of a language barrier too. Is the people who by and large say they believe in traditional marriage, it's not, you don't really
Hmm.
believe in it just because that's how your grandmother believed. Like, or is it? And if it is, then you do have some recalibration that you need to do. So why is it that you hold the views that you do? If it's traditional, then I think it's malleable. I think if it's convictional based off of, some religious principles, or maybe ontologically off the character and nature of God, then that's different. So I think when we're bringing clarity, we have to
Mhm.
say the reason that I believe this is this,
Mhm.
and and this is not based just on tradition. So tradition can be helpful, particularly when it comes to like cookie recipes and stuff, but tradition for the sake of tradition is bunk. Now, if you have consistent conviction across multiple generations, it looks like tradition, but it's not tradition. It's consistently applied conviction that gives you that illusion of tradition. So I think this is one where I would feel frustrated too if somebody said to
Mhm.
me, I don't like the way you do X because it's against my tradition. I would say, well, forget your
Mhm.
tradition. What makes your tradition right? Now, if they come back and say, I have a principled objection to this based off of these fundamental principles that guide my life, I can still disagree with them, but it's easier for me to respect the difference there than just somebody like, well, it, it if you're using tradition, it seems like a conflict
Mhm.
between two matters of opinion. And I think that's what's frustrating to a lot of people. So just a little thought on clarity there. But then to get where you're going with the Truman thing and the backlash and all of that is, and I have some thoughts on this, but I want to ask you first. Because people say, look, okay, if you're talking about sexual ethics, there are a whole lot of other things that are considered out of bounds sexually than what's represented by the rainbow flag these days. So why are Christians so up in arms about this one? Why is there backlash to this? Why do people feel this differently than they do many of the other ones? So, like, because the
Mhm.
that type of like Carl Truman isn't far enough. That type of response does seem to be unique to the rainbow flag, not to like ethical disagreements across the board. So, Cameron, given all that we've said here, I think I have an answer to this, but in light of all the other specialty months or months of special recognition, why do you think this one generates so much controversy and backlash compared to, say, Black History Month or,
Mhm.
basically every month has a special emphasis on something and two or three different emphases per month or whatever. Why this one? Um, I have an idea here, but I'd like to hear your angle on this of, you know, why is this a flashpoint? Or
I mean,
is
I
it
think to
even? Or is this dying off as like an interest thing?
no, it's not. It's not dying off, I don't think. Two major reasons probably. One would be how aggressively it's pushed and marketed. I think people start to resent that. It just it infiltrates all of entertainment. It's just there's a major agenda and it's pushed with great intensity. And so I think that's one reason. But the other I would have to say is that this constitutes probably one of the key idols of our cultural moment.
Hmm.
Major cultural idols change depending on the era and some of those preoccupations of the era. We, in our own day, are obsessed with freedom and identity and self expression, but all three of those go together. And so, because we tend to just assume, and I'm using we here, but I mean, as a culture, we tend to a default setting is to assume that sexual expression is integral to who a person is, to a person's identity. And it's also a lot of people just assume it's part of if you want to lead a whole and fulfilling life, you must be able to express yourself sexually. If you don't do that, then you're being repressed or you're being deprived in some essential way. This is a completely false anthropology. This comes to us the clearest exponent of this view is Sigmund Freud. The notion that we're, mainly at root sexual beings and that's integral to how we express ourselves. But again, most people won't see it in those terms. Most people are not going to quote Freud to you. But Christians who are paying attention to what's going on are try to be aware of the idols of their age. And so I think that's why there's a big reaction here. Also, I mean, I suppose we could keep going on. This goes along with the pushing it fairly intensely, but we have to be honest that kids are often targeted with many of these messages.
Hmm.
And I'm not saying that in some sinister way. I'm just saying a lot of the way. I mean, if you have the Disney Channel, for instance, there's a big Pride celebration collection on there as well. And obviously, we can talk about some of the kids' entertainment, where many of these elements are finding their ways. Are finding themselves in some of the cartoons and some of the, you know, some of the stories and scenarios that are marketed at children. So I think those are some of the major reasons people respond strongly to this.
Yeah, I think that's largely right. The I was talking to somebody who said, "Look, Christians sort of have a broad spectrum sexual ethics. It doesn't apply just to this issue." They said, "So why is this such a big deal?" And I said, "Well, it's because of the advocacy." I was like, "So Christians have been against
Right.
adultery forever, um, um, theoretically,
Yep.
and
Kind of a thing. Yeah.
kind of a thing, yeah." But we don't have adultery advocacy programs. Nobody's been late to work because of a
Mm.
parade celebrating adultery. You by and large don't have your boss at work saying, "Hey, you got to change your profile image, you know, on your user interface this week in order to support this." So there's a sense in which for Christians, this is a type of a thing, but this is just the one component of it that has broader advocacy. And I think because of what you highlighted there, that it touches the buttons of freedom and self expression, and so that identity piece is crucial there. So I think to back up where we've come from here, um, you're talking about we have to have clarity, and that was kind of our point one that we are making. I would add to it though that I think Cameron, you can say, "Oh, Disney this and Disney that," and whatever happening, educational curriculum, that's something to be aware of. I think for Christians, the second thing that we have to focus on in addition to clarity is consistency. And this is an interesting one here, like that plays it's a corollary to what I was just saying, that if you want to have a consistent biblical sexual ethic in line with what Jesus was teaching, that applies to a whole lot more than same-sex
Hmm.
interaction or transgenderism or anything else. Like the vast majority of the sexual temptations and confusions and problems that go through the hearts and minds of every individual on the planet and in your local church are not around LGBTQIA plus. They're there for sure,
Hmm.
but if you
Sure.
just want uh, this broad spectrum, again, is the phrase that I would use here. So I think it's important that as Christians that we in our critiques or our calling out certain forms of idolatry, that we don't give other sexual sins a pass,
Right.
and just pick on
Hmm.
one subset. So I think that consistency element is there, and I don't know that that's universally applied. Even in the sense that we would say, "Oh, this." We now see this in film. The push for the
Sure.
rainbow representatives. Okay, let's talk about fornication in film.
Correct. Yeah.
So
Yep.
it's like, is so one of these seemingly gets a pass and the other gets, a cultural
Hmm.
reaction to it. Now, again, one of those does seem to be playing with sacred definitions and traditions. I get that. But on the other hand, if we're not looking at this in terms of tradition, but we're looking at it in terms of conviction, there's a lot of sexual promiscuity and idolatry all over the place in all of our mainstream stuff.
Hmm.
So that would be the one. That would be one that I would add to your thing on clarity. That I think it's important for Christians to be consistent as well.
And what I would add along with the consistency piece is also how we deal with this in our homes and how we talk about it. So I have a friend who now is out, and this person had a Christian background as well. But it's very so during this month, this person has been pretty open about in my household, by the way, growing up as a kid, when we heard about, for instance, gay neighbors moving in, he said, I remember my my own dad saying, "Well, I sure as hell hope not." And those kinds of messages over and over again. And it's one thing, so here's where we need to listen and hear that carefully. On the one hand, we do want to be clear on where we stand. And let me be honest about this too. When we are teaching our children, I'm firmly with you to go back to some of the parenting episodes we've talked about. I don't want to query my children on how they feel about eating chocolate ice cream late at night, like Nathan said. No, no, no. I'm going to figure this out for you. And also, I don't want my kids to school me on who they are when they're little kids. They don't know who they are. It is part of my job to help them discover who they are and to do so
Mhm.
responsibly, especially as they're, in those formational years. So all of that said, But I also want to maintain a practice in my home of speaking about people who are living in ways that I believe to be sinful or misguided as though they are still people made in the image of God.
Ah,
And I
yes.
want to so I want to, I never want my kids to take away from me an aggressive or angry message when it comes to, and this becomes more of a discipline as we get older, especially as we see
Mhm.
news items or as we respond to some of what's happening in our own neck of the woods, in our own neighborhoods, in our schools. How are we talking about this? Because remember, your kids are always watching you. They're always overhearing you, and they remember my friend talking about these were conversations that transpired when he was 7 years old. He's now in his 40s, so that's worth taking to heart.
So let me watch what I do here. I'm going to make three C's: clarity, consistency, compassion, as a Christian
You just
response to
became a
Pride Month.
Baptist. Just
There
kidding.
you go. I just gave you a
Yeah.
3 point sermon with 3 points that all start with the same letter. I'm suspicious already. But anyway, I think that's what you're articulating there, Cameron, is and what we don't seem to have a lot of is people who can be compassionate and clear and consistent. So what
Hmm.
you're articulating for us is the ability to say with a heavy heart, I wish this wasn't the way that it is, in front of your children, and say, I don't think this is what God has for us in the ideal version of what Christ is saying. This is abundant life. So disagreeing with compassion, I keep coming back to an argument, discussion, conversation that I was overhearing with somebody who was wrestling with something, and my grandpa was listening to him, and he said, he said, I've never had to face that temptation and that struggle that you're going through, but he said, I do know what it's like to want to be my own God, and I fight that battle every single day. And I think there's some wisdom in
Hmm.
that. Of it's
That's good.
on one
Yeah.
hand, people can listen to this and say, well, it's pretty easy for armchair pundits to have an opinion on how I am and how I see myself and how I feel about the world and how I want to actualize my being and all of that. And I get that, because some I think a lot of the criticism and critique does come from people who haven't had to deal with or wrestle with things that it's super easy for me not to drink alcohol. It just like has never even popped in my mind as a remote temptation. I know people who fight that battle every single day. And so I can't just be like, hey, just, deal with it, get over it. It's easy. That's not how that works. But I think we can have clarity and consistency and compassion when we pull it back into the kind of that theological and spiritual realm where you were talking about earlier, Cameron, of what are the forms of idolatry? What are we being told that we can kind of conform reality to our own image? And then as that's working out, really, when I run into people who uh, see the world differently than I do in this category, it leaves me not with anger and not with fear. There's no phobia, there's no anger, it's the sorrow. Uh, and we keep coming back to this and time again. I'm at the phase of life, Cameron, where and you are too. So depending on how old you are and you're listening to this, like there's the part where you're in like high school and then your friends are coming out as gay, and that's all like kind of new and exciting. You and I, Cameron, are in the phase where we now know people who have been married, maybe have a kid, and are now transitioning or now discovering, in their mid to late 30s and 40s. Um, and you just see the train wreck that starts to unfold in their mental health and their interactions and in their relationships. And there's nothing funny about it. There's nothing. It's to me, it's just sadness all over the place. And so I think that's the position that I sit with the brokenness of confusion in these categories, is in a place of I know very clearly what I think is true here. And I get that from what I think Christ very clearly taught on this. And I want to apply that consistently in my life. And I want to interact and engage with people who are wrestling with this in deep ways from a deep place of compassion, which has moral judgment baked in it for sure, but out of wanting the best for the other, which I think is the Christ like response to this. So, yeah, certainly there will be some eye rolling when people take terminology that has historically been, part of the way that the church has talked about everything from marriage to family, and start kind of appropriating and warping and using those words in other ways. Yeah, there's a sorrow and there's a frustration to that. But anger and fear are not Christian states of mind in any category. We learn that from Christ, and those principles apply here. So I think that's the posture. We're we're running roughshod over so many parts of the complexity of this conversation. But I think for those of us who are Christians who are trying to live faithfully and to engage the world well, these three C's give us some, I think, broad base platform in order to respond in a Christ-like way.
Yeah, and we will come back to this subject as always because it's one that's of continued interest and continues to develop. But thanks for hanging with us here. You've been listening to Thinking Out Loud, a podcast where we think out loud about current events in Christian hope.
Thanks for listening to Thinking Out Loud. If you'd like to learn more about what we do, book Nathan or Cameron, or if you'd like to support us financially, whether through a one-time donation or on a monthly basis, you can do so on the donate page at www.toltogether.com. That's toltogether.com. And please consider leaving us a 5-star rating and sharing this content with your friends. It really does help.